The number you have reached, 911, has been changed to a non-published number.
Hi, and welcome to Lex TV. Yes, we switched the name back. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why we switched the name back. Just suffice it to say, I've given up trying to get everything to work on iTunes. And I'm just going to do WMV format from now on, and hopefully those of you out there will be able to get it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to go over three things. We have three topics today. First is going to be a quick overview of who's actually coming here and what they're looking for. The second is going to be 5 or 6 news items and blog entries from different blogs that have been interesting, noteworthy this week. And the last is going to be a quick overview of those video blogs and podcasts that I actually listen to and I recommend to y'all. You may not agree with me, but they're the ones I look at. Anyway, let's start with the first thing. First of all, what we're going to go over today is who's coming to the blog. Now, let me tell you what I did here. I basically took at random times during the day, one in the early morning, one in the afternoon or evenings for the last 4 days, and took down a list of where everybody came from. Approximately, 20% of the hits came from different universities and colleges around the country, around the United States. And we had a number of hits from different countries. And let me tell you, the obviously, or as might be predictable, the most hits came from countries where people spoke English. And the top hits came from the United Kingdom and Canada, which both had the same number of hits. Behind them came Australia, and then came an interesting one. The next one after Australia was Japan, and looking at the hits on Japan, it looks like, perhaps there's 2 or 3 people reading this, either that or the person who's actually reading it in Japan is moving around the country quite a bit. Following Japan came Germany. There were a few hits from Germany, and there again it seems like, they may be random hits because there weren't quite so many of them, and they came from different areas, and they also may be a couple people reading the blog. Beyond that, we get to the point where you're getting 3 hits apiece. We get down to France, Sweden, and the Ivory Coast. Not sure why people from the Ivory Coast are reading it, but you're welcome to come by and read it anytime. It's kind of interesting that you're here. And then there's, the lesser hit ones, Spain, Poland, Austria, Philippines, Argentina, Norway, all had a couple hits during this time. And then there's honorable mentions. I do want to mention New Zealand and Brazil. Now, while it's kind of strange, when I do a check usually to see who's reading here, I almost invariably, you can use the map function on SiteMeter, almost invariably shows somebody reading this blog from Brazil or New Zealand. But the random times I chose just didn't happen. They weren't on it. But I do think I get at least one person in Brazil and one person in New Zealand who reads here fairly commonly. And you're welcome here. Now, I did go back and check to see how many people from Virginia were actually reading it. And over the 4-day period, I had 199 hits from Virginia, all over the Commonwealth, from places I'd never heard of to, the normal places like Charlottesville and Richmond. You might take like 10 of those out as being actually hits that I initiated while checking things out in the blog, but there was a fair number of hits. Now, those are all out of, approximately, SiteMeter gives me 100 hit blocks that I can check, and I made sure they didn't overlap. So that's out of about 800 hits. The maximum hits from other countries were 26, like I said, from Canada and Great Britain, or the United Kingdom. And so that's who's reading the blog from around the world and around the country. I didn't really break down who was reading it from what state by state, because that would have been, well, a heck of a lot of work. It did look like there were a lot of people reading the blog from California, and there was a smattering from pretty much everywhere else. But those are who are reading the blog. Now, the question comes up, what are they coming here for? Now, by using one of the another service, I was able to track what searches people are using to come here. By and large, the largest majority of people who are doing searches to come here are looking for some sort of legal matter. They're looking for, trying to figure out what a capias is or something like that. Sometimes they type a question. Sometimes it's like capias, Virginia, General District Court, something like that. Behind them is kind of a general information thing where people are searching for the news item of the day, and they trip across my blog because I've been writing about something like that, or they're looking for. Now, when we get past that, the thing that I find is a lot of people come here under the search term malicious wounding, which I assume is because I've done a number of blog entries on malicious wounding. It's been probably the most serious crime I've represented somebody on so far, and I've had a number of them. It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure why I have had a lot of them, but I have. And then, of course, there are always the people that are looking for, criminal law blogs and people who are looking for Lammer's name. Not usually me specifically, although every once in a while Ken Lammers. But there's different. Apparently, there's a fairly decent number of Lammers out there in the United States or in the world, despite the fact that I have never met anybody with my last name outside of my immediate family. Okay, now, then we get to the strange things that people are searching for when they come here. And, you get things like figuring a lock combination. No, folks, I'm not going to help you figure out how to break a lock combination. And then there's people who come here for fashion advice, fashion information. And over the last 2 days, I've gotten hits on this. When can I wear, or fashion advice blazer sports coat. When can I wear seersucker? Season to wear seersucker. When to wear seersucker. Okay, so fashion advice blazer sports coat. Blue. Okay, that's pretty much as far as it goes. Don't wear it during a felony jury trial. And then, when can I wear seersucker? Never. No, do not wear seersucker. I know that people have fallen in love with this, but I don't know why. I got to tell you, my feeling on seersucker is summed up by the one guy who I know who wears it every year, and he's got one suit which is white with blue stripes, and I kid you not, looks like a mattress. It looks like they tore up a mattress to make his suit. They just don't work, folks. Let the fashion die. Okay, now, since we've gotten past my fashion advice for the day, we also get, I get hits every single day, it seems like. I get at least one hit looking for Karina Stenquist, which is over at Mobuzz blog, or not blog, but vlog or vodcast or whatever you want to call it. It's a video cast, which about 2 to 3 5-minute video cast that's put out Monday through Friday. And it's done in Spanish and English, and Stenquist does the English version. Now, there are several things that you should know. I'm not Karina Stenquist, guys, so you're looking in the wrong place. Now, there are ways you can distinguish between us. First of all, she apparently lives in Spain, because the rest of the podcast and all that's done in Spanish. She does the English version. I live in Virginia. Okay, now, second of all, I lost my paper. Second of all, okay, obviously she lives in Spain. She speaks Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. I've had one semester of ancient Greek, one semester of modern German. I don't remember either of those, much of them. I remember more of the Greek than the German. High school, 3 years of Latin. The Army taught me Arabic. And in college, I studied ancient Hebrew. Don't have any Spanish in there, folks. None whatsoever. So, that's another way you can tell us apart. Okay. And our jobs. Well, apparently her job is to be an announcer on a video cast over the internet. And I think it's also meant to go over phones. It might be primarily meant to go over phones. I haven't figured out how to do that with my phone yet. Someday I will. And for God's sakes, folks, she's a 20-something young lady who's apparently, went to Berkeley or someplace in California for school and is now living in Spain, in Europe. So if half the stereotypes are true, she's going to be, somewhere left of Marx. I am a slightly older male living in a red state who went to Washington Lee College of Law, School of Law, a private university, and then a private undergrad as well, who served in the military for 6 years. Okay, that, if half the stereotypes are true, puts me somewhere right of Hitler. I suspect if you put us in the same room, there would be some sort of explosion. We are not, this is not the place to look for Karina Stenquist. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, now mind you, her video cast is humorous. It's fun to watch every day. I'm just saying, why are you coming here? And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our discussion today for what's going on here, why people are coming to the blog, and who's coming to the blog. With that, we'll move on to the next section. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go over what news items have caught my attention over the last week or so, or even, well, actually more like the last couple days. First of all, from the DetroitNews.com, actually DETnews.com, we have news that a federal prosecutor, Richard Covertino, is being charged with obstruction of justice for either, the story isn't exactly right on about what exactly was going on, but apparently they either manufactured evidence or removed evidence or refused to give it to the defense attorneys when they should have, or a combination of all three of these things during a terrorism trial, and eventually the DOJ asked the courts to withdraw the convictions even. Now, unfortunately, we see these kind of cases every, 6 months or so, where some prosecutor has been tagged for having done something wrong and is facing charges. And we see the same thing on the defense side, so I'm not signaling anybody out, But so what makes this case really anything different? Well, what makes this case different is that Mr. Covertino, approximately 2 years ago, filed a whistleblower suit against the federal government, the DOJ and Ashcroft. And while if he'd have filed it 2 weeks ago, I might have said it was a preemptive act to try to, get the government before they got him. He filed it 2 years ago, which makes the government's act in filing this indictment very suspicious to me, because it would seem to me that, it may not be improper, but it has the appearance of impropriety. It appears as though the government is striking back because of what he did. He may be guilty of sin. I don't know. Don't know the guy. Don't know what was going on. But it really looks suspicious because of the way it happened. By the way, if you want to read his complaint, against the federal government, go to Google and look up Richard Covertino, Covertino, and you'll be able to see his complaint. It's 38 pages. I kind of think it's inartfully drafted, but it goes through minute by minute all the things that he thinks were wrong. Okay, the next item is going to be Decision of the Day, and this is a blog that you can read. You can get to from under my criminal law section of my blog, and it is a case called U.S. against Ali from the 8th Circuit this last week, and this is one of those cases trying to figure out exactly where Miranda lies, where Miranda should be used, and who has the burdens and all sorts of things. Now, as some of you will remember, for a while there was a police tactic where the police would bring the guy in, not read him his Miranda rights. They would ask him all the questions, get the confession from him, then read him his Miranda rights, ask him the same questions over again, and get his confession from him again. Not use the first confession, but use the second confession, because the second confession was Mirandized, and he knew his rights when he made the second confession. This is the kind of thing that drives defense attorneys nuts, and leaves the prosecutor across the aisle from you kind of grinning as he gets this through, and a judge actually buys that. And a lot of judges were buying that, to the point that it actually made it to the Supreme Court of the United States, whereupon the Supreme Court of the United States went, "What?" and said, "No." And it was kind of a soft decision. It doesn't say a bright line exactly, but basically said, no, you can't do that. So what we get then is you have a situation where, and there are true-to-life, actual situations where an officer is not going to read Miranda to somebody ahead of time. If he's brought in somebody's wife to interrogate them, and he just happens to be chatting with her husband out in the hall, and all of a sudden the husband admits to a triple murder or something like that. Well, obviously the policeman hadn't intended that to happen. He was talking to the wife, and so then he would read Miranda and go from there. So there are situations where the officer wouldn't read Miranda ahead of time. However, there are also the question is, was it a situation like that, or was it a situation where he actually meant to mislead someone, get them to confess, and then read him Miranda and get him to confess again? Being one of those evil, kind of suspicious defense attorneys, I feel that most of the times when my clients are asked to go to the police department, that's what they intend to do. Although they will swear up and down that my client could have left at any moment, up until the moment I read him Miranda. That's when I decided I was going to arrest him. Yeah. But the question here is, and the interesting question here is, who has to prove it? Who has to prove that the person could have left at any moment up till that, and that the Miranda didn't need to be read? Well, the 8th Circuit says it's the government's burden of proof. The government has to prove that they weren't holding this guy, it wasn't a coercive situation, and he could have left at any moment. And he perceived it that way. Which makes sense. It's the way I think it should be. Kind of interested to see how the 4th Circuit comes down on this. I suspect that it might not have the same result. Next, we get from Cybercrime Law, another blog you can get under my criminal law section on the links. And here we find out the Florida Attorney General, Charlie Crist, is subpoenaing names from domain registrars. And what he's doing is he's trying to track down companies, or who's responsible for companies which are using spoofers for IDs, telephone IDs, so that when I call you, I use one of these sites, I call you, and my caller ID says 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, or says the Governor's Mansion, or something like that. The Florida Attorney General is saying, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. People rely upon what it says, who it says is calling, and you can't commit a fraud upon them like that. The answer to that is why private investigators and bill collectors use this, and therefore it's a legitimate service, which is not something that's going to garner a whole lot of sympathy from the public at large, at least not from anybody who's ever been bugged half to death by a bill collector. And then the next thing we have is, well, in the United Kingdom, they're trying to do jury trials again. Well, at least they're trying to do away with them in complex fraud questions because, citizens are just too stupid to sit through a trial and figure out who's lying and what's going on. As opposed to a judge who's been an attorney most of his life probably and done criminal law and maybe some personal injury and that kind of stuff, who, of course, is going to know the ins and outs of every accounting principle and every kind of way of keeping track of funds and all of the business practices and standards. He's going to know those inside and out and be able to understand every little bit of it. Yeah. Okay. Now, mind you, theoretically, at least, judges are going to be smarter. But, these are the kind of things that, why are people getting lost in these things? Well, because they're daggone complicated. The solution here isn't to get rid of a jury trial. If you're worried that it's too complex for a baker, a housewife, and your local sheriff deputy to understand, well, your solution then is to change the makeup of your jury. Still have a randomly drawn jury, but have it of people who have graduate degrees, doctors, lawyers, professors, that sort of thing. If you still think that is too easy, well, then go and get a pool composed of businessmen who are officers in businesses and sort of things like that. Of course, that'll never happen because, my God, we can't have these people away from their job for 2 weeks, because IBM might fall apart if a mid-level manager who works in accounting disappears for 2 weeks. Okay. It's time for professionals to step up and serve anyway. Change who you call for jury duty. Don't get rid of juries. Next thing we have is from my backyard, Richmond, Virginia. I actually live in a county that's a suburb of Richmond, Virginia. A police officer in Richmond, Virginia, who's been on the force for 8 years, Goldie Renee Weaver, was arrested last week as part of a gambling ring. Apparently it was a family-run thing and ran at her mom's house in another county, a county north of Richmond. I'm in the county south of Richmond. County north of Richmond. And mom was, taking cuts of several $1,000s per night apparently during different poker and whatever other gambling was going on. And Officer Weaver's job apparently was to deal the cards. So, well, I suspect that's probably the end of her career as a police officer in Richmond. Never know exactly, but I suspect it is. And finally, what we have is from Japundant. And this is proof positive that if you're going to do burglary, at the very least, if you're going to do burglary, you should case the place ahead of time. Guy comes to a house. The door's open. Doesn't find anybody in the bedroom. He's going through stuff, getting ready to make off with a hell of a haul, when the person who lives there walks in behind him. Okay, some people might try to turn into a strong-arm robbery then. Some people might try to run. The problem is, the person who lived there, who walked in behind him, was a sumo wrestler. I'm sure blocking the entire door wasn't very difficult for this gentleman. And he grabbed the burglar and started squeezing him. Meanwhile, while he's squeezing the burglar, he screams for help from his fellow sumo wrestlers who live there with him. Needless to say, the burglar, he's now residing in jail in Japan. Certain things you check out ahead of time, folks. And that's it for our news stories. In the next group, we're going to talk about some of the video blogs and podcasts, which are all pretty much linked on my site. I find them interesting. You may or may not, but I'm going to give you my rundown of what I think of them all. So now what we're going to talk about are the video casts and podcasts that I watch. To begin with, we'll talk about one I've talked about a little bit already. There's MoBuzz TV or MoBuzz, I don't know if it's called TV or what, but MoBuzz, which is fun. It is just fun to watch every day. Karina Stenquist does the English version of it. There's also a Spanish version of it for those of you who speak Spanish, although I suspect that it's probably done in, and forgive me out there if any of you speak Spanish, but I just remember this from when I was in the Army. I had, in my unit, had a number of people with different languages in it, and we had the Puerto Ricans and we had the Mexicans, and we had one guy who spoke Spanish, who was from Spain, and they used to just mercilessly just go after this guy about how terrible his Spanish was, how he always spoke with a lisp. And they said, and I'm told, I don't know, don't speak Spanish, that everybody in Spain speaks with a lisp. At least that's what the Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in my unit used to say. Could be a total lie and a total fabrication, but I leave it to you. Those of you who actually speak Spanish can go to the site and see if they're speaking with a lisp. Although I suspect, having seen the Spanish broadcasts, that when you're watching the broadcast in Spanish, unless you concentrate on what's being said very closely, you'll probably sightsee more than you will listen. Okay, now on to the next site, Rocket Boom. Rocket Boom is probably the most popular among these types of sites. It is humor-based. I find Rocket Boom to be very hit or miss. About one in every 4 or 5 I find is really interesting. And part of that is because it's New York-based, and it's about New York, and it's by a New Yorker. And a lot of times it's things that I just really don't have any interest in. That's not to say that you won't find something interesting in it. And I will say it's high quality, well put together, actually obviously well thought out and well planned. Just doesn't tickle my fancy all that often. Now there have been ones that I just thought were amazing and were fun to watch, like her 1 year episode where she goes through and dances all through New York. That one's fun. It really is, and I suggest going back and watch it. And it is fun to check in. I mean, it is one to check in on every so often because some days it is really hilarious. Okay, the next thing, Tiki Bar. Okay, if you don't know what Tiki Bar is yet, well, where you been? Tiki Bar is a bunch of guys getting together, and a gal, Lala, getting together and putting together skits. My favorite has been the, I think, Red October skit. The London Fog Cutter one was pretty good too. If you go back and you watch the first ones, they're just fun to watch because there's a bunch of guys and gals sitting around getting blitzed while they're putting on these skits and using the skits as an excuse to put forward recipes for different kinds of mixed drinks. I don't know how much serious work they put into it. They obviously did some pretty good video work on them, but I don't know how seriously they were taking this at the beginning. Nowadays, after it's become a fairly big hit, some of them seem a little bit forced. Still, they are interesting to watch, and there is always Lala. Okay, now beyond the fun, blogs to watch or video logs to watch, there's political ones. Now, the only political one that I link to is bloggingheads.tv. I don't necessarily agree with what's on Blogging Heads TV all that often, but it's an interesting, watching the way they've got it set up is really interesting, and they do talk about some interesting topics every once in a while. But they have, side by side, they have the two heads and two people, and they're in different locations, and they're talking, and it has been synchronized perfectly every time I've watched it. It's well put together. I think I figured out how they do it, or at least I could do it on one of my programs that I use for video. But it's got to take some effort, and it's got to take some time to put together. And it's impressive that they do it. They talk about it's generally people who write blogs or write columns for a living, and so they talk about the politics. Every single one of them could be living within the Beltway for all I know, because that's generally what they're talking about. It's what's important inside the Beltway. I will admit that I first was drawn there by the technicals part of it. I keep listening, just because it's interesting to hear them talk about what's going on. It is leftward leaning, at the very least, leftward leaning, but it's an interesting video broadcast, and I recommend it to y'all. Now, the remainder of the blog podcasts and videocasts are tech-based podcasts and videocasts. And for those of you that have been around for a while, all this kind of devolves from Tech TV. Tech TV, which was a program, which was a channel, which put on programs about, technical items, obviously, technology. It had things like screensavers, call for help, X-Play, all these other things. And it was really kind of an interesting and good show, a good channel. And after putting years of work into it and developing kind of a cult of personality around 2 or 3 people who people would tune in every day to watch, including myself, I watched Screensavers religiously with Patrick Norton and Leo Laporte, eventually becoming Patrick Norton and Kevin Rose, and Leo Laporte moving to Call for Help. Watched it religiously. So, of course, what happens? It makes profit 1 year. Finally gets to the point it's making profit and having a large fan base. Gets bought out by G4 TV, which is the most god-awful, terrible channel that was put on God's green earth. It then gutted all the good programs, drove Screensavers into the ground, and got rid of Call for Help, and ended up putting things on 24 hours a day about games. Okay, you can only do so much about games. Funny thing was that G4's best program for a long time was X-Play, which was a program about games which they'd gotten from Tech TV. All the other shows basically were flops or destroyed. And, of course, they lost ratings, and now they've gone so bad that they've replaced their nighttime lineup with Star Trek reruns because, all of us that are interested in technology, we want to watch Star Trek reruns. Yeah, okay. But what happened after this channel self-destructed is that people who were there when it was Tech TV, before it became G4, went off and they did their own technical things. They went off, got jobs, and then they kind of coalesced together again on something which started out as called Revenge of the Screensavers, and became very quickly, after I'm certain a couple of friendly letters, became This Week in Tech, which is a weekly podcast about items that are going on technologically, and the people who are involved in them, who's developing things, what companies are doing what, and talking about the newest breaking technology. It's an interesting program. It's about an hour long, usually put out every Monday, and they call it Twit instead of This Week in Tech now. It's called Twit. And it has 3 or 4 different people, all of whom were pretty much survivors from the old Tech TV. Growing out of this, and what you have to understand, there's kind of a cult of personality around Leo Laporte, and growing out of his Twit, you then get other programs which have popped up. You get, Patrick Norton and them over on a show called Digital Life TV. Now, this is a video cast that's done 7 o'clock Tuesdays and Thursdays. For those of us on here in the East Coast, I think it's 4 o'clock on the Pacific. So, but 7 o'clock Tuesdays and Thursdays, live on your computer. If you got high-speed internet, you can watch it live, or you can download it later. And it's the most professional of the over the internet videocast so far. I mean, they're obviously putting a lot of effort into making it work, trying to get the best cameras, good sound, good sets, the whole 9 yards. Now, what Digital Life TV is, usually they review a game, they review some sort of hardware, one or two things of hardware, and they almost every time talk about digital TVs or HD TVs, that sort of thing. And they answer some questions which they've gotten from emails. It's interesting. It is almost 100% the old screensavers format put back together and running well. Now, beyond that, you also have Kevin Rose and Alex Albright over at Revision 3, which they put together a show called Dignation, which outlines some of the biggest hits on their Dig website. And Dig, for those of you who don't know, is a website which people decide what the top technical stories that they want to read are, and they give it points, and it goes up, and more people read it, and so they go through and they kind of pick through and decide which of these stories, the top stories, they think are worth putting on Dignation. They're every week audio podcast, followed by a little bit later a video podcast later in the week. I don't watch the video very often, and it goes through several technical stories. You never know exactly what the technical stories are going to be, although often they're pretty close to what you see on TWiT or DLTV, Digital Life TV. Beyond that, there's Command N, which is Amber MacArthur and Mike Lazazara and a couple family members and friends who put together another tech show, which is fairly well put together. They're doing it in Canada, which makes it a little bit different. I don't know why. Maybe because they have to convert what kind of costs whenever you're talking about technology. And then there's, Inside the Net, which is another Revision 3 thing, more professionally done than Dignation. Dignation has kind of descended into a little bit too much drinking going on in it anymore, to the point that it sometimes hurts the show. And I think that's pretty much it. I recommend all of those. Personally, I think that, TWiT and Dignation are interesting to listen to. Command N's pretty interesting to watch. I think DLTV, Digital Life TV, is the one that's probably going to blossom into something more serious in the future and be the thing to watch as it goes on. TWiT's always kind of fun to listen to because it is a bunch of the people that the Cult of Personality coalesced around, and it's interesting to listen to them talk about what's going on. But, as I say, I think DLTV is the one that's going to be out there in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's all I've got for today. The little red light's blinking on my camera, which tells me I'm out of time. So I'm going to wrap it up. Don't think I've given any legal advice today, but I'll give the same thing I always say. If you think anything in here is interesting legally, go look it up yourself, because I didn't do enough research for you to be able to cite it to a judge. And if you cite anything to a judge that I've said here today, you're nuts. Don't do it. Go do your research, make sure everything's there, and, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you've enjoyed what we've done today. Maybe you got a little bit out of it. And I'll see you next week on next week's edition of Lex TV.